The Legend of Zelda's light arrows are among the series' most iconic items. Sacred bolts of golden energy which vaporize enemies and directly oppose evil. The light arrows first appeared in Ocarina of Time, given to Link by Princess Zelda, arrows infused with the divine power to repel darkness. The arrows returned in Majora's Mask in a somewhat similar form, and have since appeared in the Minish Cap, Twilight Princess, Spirit Tracks, A Link Between Worlds, and Breath of the Wild. But all pale in comparison to the holy might of the arrows obtained by the Hero of Winds, weapons of pure annihilation. In addition to being able to damage Puppet Ganon and being able to stun Ganondorf himself, the light arrows of the Wind Waker will, on impact, cause a regular enemy to erupt into a blinding light, and then vanish entirely. The light arrow's obliteration doesn't discriminate. The lowly Bokoblin and the mighty armor-clad Darknut both meet the same spectacular fate. A couple of weeks ago we looked at the possible origins of a similar item from Breath of the Wild, the Sheikah-made ancient arrows, which also appear to instantly tear regular enemies from reality. So let's have a look at the Wind Waker's sacred projectiles, how they work, and their possible origins. Most light arrows in the series are closely tied to Princess Zelda, given to Link by the Princess in Ocarina of Time, Breath of the Wild and A Link Between Worlds, and used by her in Twilight Princess and Spirit Tracks. But while Zelda does eventually take up the light arrows in the Wind Waker, she has nothing to do with how Link obtains them. They're instead found strangely in Ganon's tower, towards the end of the showdown with Phantom Ganon. Unlike most other light arrows, there's no sacred ceremony before they're obtained. They're not forged by the light spirits or created using the light of the Triforce by Zelda, they're just found in a spiked chest deep in the labyrinthian Dark Tower. Yet they clearly are sacred, able to pierce pure evil itself. So how did they end up here? And why, unlike most other light arrows, do they obliterate enemies instantaneously? The mystery of how the light arrows ended up in Ganon's tower aside, we can start to look at the effect they have on basic enemies. When struck, multiple beams of brilliant light shine outwards from the enemy, who themselves appear to turn white, completely motionless. The enemy themselves then glow even brighter with this white light, before suddenly the light collapses inwards into a single vertical beam, leaving behind a single item. This of course isn't always the case. On Puppet Ganon and Ganondorf himself, the light arrow will explode into the bright beams of light, but the enemy will just be stunned, covered in crackling energy similar to when Ganondorf was struck by the light arrows during Ocarina of Time. So it's obvious that they are sacred. Their descriptions note that they can pierce pure evil itself, so perhaps the reason that they absolutely eradicate regular enemies is just the result of some sort of overload of sacred energy, directly extinguishing servants of Ganondorf with holy light. However, the impact of a light arrow isn't the only time we see this exact effect in the Wind Waker. The very same explosion of light appears whenever a great fairy vanishes. Just like with the light arrows, brilliant beams of light shine outwards from the fairy, who turns white and begins to shrink, disappearing into a thin beam of light. Even the sound effects are the exact same. So, do the light arrows somehow harness Great Fairy magic, instantly removing an enemy from existence the very same way that the fairies themselves disappear? The Wind Waker's Great Fairies are interesting in that, after Link's initial meeting with them, they can't be revisited. It seems like, just as smaller fairies are apparently consumed when they heal Link, the Great Fairies too vanish when their purpose has been fulfilled. It's very possible that the light arrows extinguish enemies as if they were fairies who had served their purpose. The other magical arrows in the Wind Waker, the fire and ice arrows, function similarly to the light arrows in that they use Link's magic meter when they're fired. They're used for both combat and puzzle solving, including accessing 2 elemental islands, and are given to Link by a great fairy, or rather the Queen of Fairies. a mysterious being who seems to be above all other fairies in power and influence, shown holding a puppet of one of the spirits. If the light arrows do use the magic of fairies, which it does appear that they do, could they have been made by a great fairy, or by the Queen of Fairies herself? Great fairies have always been closely tied to Link's weapons. The most famous and direct example is the Great Fairy's sword from Majora's Mask, but they also grant Link new combat abilities like the magical spin attack and Din's fire in Ocarina of Time, and upgrade his items in A Link to the Past. But above all, one great fairy in particular, the Cursed Fairy, not only upgrades the Master Sword, but bestows upon Link the Silver Arrows, sacred projectiles required to kill Ganon. Not only do the Silver Arrows directly oppose Ganon himself, but they deal massive damage to regular enemies, destroying most in a single hit, just like the Light Arrows. So the Great Fairies are obviously capable of creating these weapons, meaning it's very possible that they were responsible for the creation of the Wind Waker's light arrows. And for such an incredibly powerful arrow, it wouldn't be surprising if they were made in an age long past by the Queen of the Fairy World. With a possibility for the origin and source of power for the light arrows, we can look at the second mystery: why these sacred weapons are found in Ganon's tower, obtained during the boss fight against Phantom Ganon. While Great Fairies are sometimes closely connected to Ganon's lairs, such as the Cursed Fairy from A Link to the Past being found in the Pyramid, or the Great Fairy of Courage from Ocarina of Time being found near Ganon's castle, I don't think it's likely that a fairy is the reason they're found in this dark tower in the Wind Waker. Instead, I think it's the simpler answer: Ganondorf placed them here himself. The Ganondorf of the Wind Waker is one defined by his defeat centuries ago at the hands of the Hero of Time. This is the same man who once had the Master Sword rammed deep into his skull, and was sealed by the sages in a void in the Sacred Realm. He knows firsthand what it means to face and lose to a hero, and many of Ganondorf's plans are designed deliberately to prevent this eventuality. The Master Sword, the blade which ended his reign as tyrannical overlord of Hyrule, is a weapon that Ganondorf has a particular hatred for, as you'd expect, and he takes deliberate steps to limit its power, slaying the sages who maintained its ability to repel evil. When Link draws the blade and first comes face to face with the Gerudo, he's told that the sword's edges are dull, its power gone, that it no longer sparkles with the power to repel evil. The Master Sword was of course the primary weapon used to defeat Ganondorf at the climax of Ocarina of Time, and its neutralization was therefore a main focus of his plan in the Wind Waker. But I doubt that the King of Evil would have forgotten the sting of the light arrows, used to stun him during the showdown in his castle. If he took steps to limit the power of the Blade of Evil's Bane, might he have also focused on the secondary sacred weapons of the hero, the light arrows? While Hyrule Historia seems to suggest that Ganondorf slayed the sages of Earth and Wind after the Great Flood, very shortly before the game itself seems to contradict this, with Naruto claiming that after his initial defeat, Ganondorf returned in a red wrath, attacking the temples and slaying the sages, which makes a lot more sense, and gives enough time for the sages to reasonably have descendants who can carry their instruments. When Ganondorf managed to break free of the void in the Sacred Realm, set loose on Hyrule in a burning fury, he immediately focused on limiting the Master Sword's power. So what if he not only killed the sages to suppress the sword, but stole the light arrows, sealing them in his fortress-like tower? An issue with this idea is that if a great fairy forged these light arrows, then when and how did Ganondorf find them? They're clearly different to the light arrows from Ocarina of Time, so it's unclear when they were made and how Ganondorf would have known about them. But the same problem exists with how Ganondorf would have known about the sages of Earth and Wind, or how he knew about the locations of the spiritual stones prior to Ocarina of Time. Ganondorf, in his scheming, has been shown on multiple occasions to know a lot more about the powers of the world than it would initially seem, and is far more than the mindless, rampaging monster he eventually becomes. On the other hand, it's possible that the King of Evil seized the light arrows sometime after the Great Flood, during his return to power. He actually does attack the Great Fairies in the Wind Waker, albeit mainly passively. Many of the fairy islands are blocked off by a hazard, from large rocks to rings of fire or spined roots. Not only this, but one great fairy is actually found within the stomach of a big octo, requiring Link to slay the sea monster to free it. So it's equally possible that, as Ganondorf set in motion his plans to find Princess Zelda, he also took the precaution to seize and store the light arrows from a fairy. The Wind Waker's light arrows are by far the most powerful weapons in the game, and some of the most awesome in the series. Being found within Ganon's tower, with no clear explanation as to why, adds a layer of mystery to the arrows, somewhat similar to Majora's Mask's and Spirit Track's iterations of the items. The fact that they annihilate simple enemies in the very same fashion in which great fairies vanish, coupled with the fact that the Queen of Fairies herself grants Link the only other magical arrows in the game, means it's very likely that these arrows too could be the result of fairy magic. A power so brilliant and true that Ganondorf feared them, sealing them within his dark tower. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, leave a like or subscribe if you haven't already for more Zelda content. Cheers guys, and I'll see you next time.